Getting a world title shot in the UFC has to be one of the hardest things to achieve in mixed martial arts. People fight their entire lives and never even get close. And given that usually you have to work your way through whatever division's rankings you are in, by the time you do get a title shot, you've probably already made a name for yourself, at least amongst the hardcore fans. But today we're going to have a look at all those fighters who were basically completely unknown when they were given a chance to become world champion. I'm Bailey in from MMA On Point. I want to say thank you to all of the OP channel members for supporting these videos, and these are 10 unknown fighters who fought for a UFC title. Number 10, Jana Kunetsky. Getting Chris Cyborg in the UFC had to happen, but for the 500 days she held the belt, it kind of just felt like the division was completely empty. Tonya Evinger fought Chris for the vacant title. Now, she was fairly well known in the hardcore community as she'd been fighting on the scene since 2006. And then after that, Holly Holm got another title shot. She's one of the bigger names in women's MMA. But after that, well, it kind of already felt like the UFC had run out of options. Can't throw Holly straight back in there, can you? I mean, can you? Wouldn't have put it past them, but no, instead the shot went to Jana Kunetsky. Now, Jana had fought exclusively in Russia for the first 7 years of her career and got a title shot at the Invicta belt in her US debut, but that fight is actually probably more remembered for that weird ref call.
Oh, and Tanya just standing in the face. Technically, I don't think it's illegal. It was an odd ending as Mike England was telling Evinger not to stand on the face.
I don't feel like it was something that she did. I got the appeal in as soon as I could, and the commission did what was right.
The win for Jana instead got turned into a no contest, and it might have been the most attention she got while she was in Invicta. And I feel like since women's MMA had come into the UFC, only less and less people were watching women's MMA outside of it. When they called Jana to give her the title shot against Cyborg, she had had 0 UFC fights and hadn't fought at featherweight in 6 years. I mean, I feel like even if you'd seen every women's featherweight UFC fight at that point, you still had no clue who she was. Number 9, Joe Soto. Okay, so there's being rushed to a UFC title, and then there's Joe Soto, who got one of the most insane title shot opportunities in the history of the sport. Joe did make a little bit of a name for himself in Bellator when he won the inaugural featherweight title, but that was way back in 2009. It wasn't until 6 years later that he made it to the UFC after having a run in Tachi Palace Fights, which is again a great show in California, but not a major league that a lot of fans were watching. And you know, that was reflected in where the UFC put him on the early prelims of the 177 pay-per-view. It was fighting another UFC newcomer in Anthony Burchak. It was a perfectly normal UFC debut for an unknown guy. None of that mattered though, because on weigh-in day, everything fell apart and Renan Barão had to be pulled from the card.
Renan Barão failed to make weight. He had a medical issue, was removed from the fight last minute.
So Joe Soto went from helping to get the night started to filling in and fighting the champion in the main event on basically 24 hours notice and in his UFC debut. Again, unless you were watching featherweight Bellator in 2009, 6 years before this all happened, Joe Soto might as well have been your bloody landlord. The bantamweight division had really been hotting up in the UFC, and you could pay as much attention to it as you want, you were not going to know who Joe Soto was. Still, he got in there and fought on 24 hours notice, which is bloody commendable. Number 8, Sarah McMahon. Armbar after armbar from Ronda Rousey in Strikeforce got enough attention from Dana White for him to finally allow women in the UFC. And the first couple of contenders they lined up for Ronda had done a fair amount of work before they got to the big show. Liz Carmouche had already fought for the Strikeforce title as an undefeated challenger. Then Miesha Tate, she'd already been a champion in that organization and already had a rivalry with Ronda. But then next up was Sarah McMahon, who UFC fans had only ever seen one time when she made her debut in the second prelim fight at UFC 159. I doubt many people had seen her career outside of the UFC before that. She'd only been competing as a pro for a year and a bit, but she was undefeated and she had also competed in the Olympics. Not sure many people remember the women's wrestling divisions of the Olympics, but it was a big achievement and I totally get why the UFC made the fight. Wrestling versus judo, 2 Olympic athletes, and they used that to sell the fight against Ronda because, to be honest, they didn't really have anything else they could use. Sarah McMahon kind of came out of nowhere and was just lined up as another contender for Ronda to take out. Number 7, Ali Bagautinov. For a while in the UFC, we didn't know who the best flyweight on the planet was. I mean, okay, there wasn't even a division for it, so how could we? But as soon as we made the division, it was totally dominated by one man. Demetrius Johnson had some great contenders to deal with at first. Joseph Benavidez with years of high-level experience in the WEC. There were guys like John Dodson who had built a name for themselves and won the Ultimate Fighter. I mean, Demetrius was running through a lot of high-level contenders at first. But it wasn't long before the UFC kind of ran out of competition, had to start throwing him guys who had pretty much only just arrived in the UFC. Ali Bagautinov arrived in September 2013 after spending his whole career at regional promotions in Russia, and then by June the next year, just 9 months later, he was fighting DJ for a world title. I mean, that's barely enough time to build any fan support. He'd banged out 3 UFC fights, but it didn't help a lot of people weren't really even paying attention to the division at that time because it was the smallest weight class. I guess some fans just don't want to watch it. I mean, there were also other guys who went up against Demetrius Johnson way too early, like Kyoji Horiguchi, but we barely knew who Bagautinov was before he was thrust in there to challenge the champ. Number 6, Travis Lutter. The UFC debut of Travis Lutter didn't go too badly. He was a BJJ black belt under Carlos Machado, and then he knocked out Marvin Eastman in round 2.
And a big shot by Travis Lutter! One-punch knockout!
He came back to the UFC twice more after that, but lost in both of his fights. And then we didn't really see him till The Ultimate Fighter Season 4, where they invited UFC vets on the show, and the winners of the season were going to get title shots against the champs. It was a pretty crazy concept, and Season 4's not a bad season, and we all had a chat in the office about what we remembered from it. You know, you had Matt Serra on there, and Dean Thomas, an iconic duo who we still see and looking for a fight. Shoney Carter was in there as well. He was always a crazy guy. Of course, Patrick Cote was back and on that show. But of all the things we remembered, none of us mentioned the name Travis Lutter. And he was the guy who won the middleweight bracket and then would get a title shot against Anderson Silva. Now that part is easy to remember, as historically it was kind of a crazy thing to happen, and Lutter even missed weight, so it isn't technically a title fight. But the point is, even being on Season 4 with so many characters, well, no one really could remember or knew who Travis Lutter was. I mean, he'd had a couple of UFC fights, which was more than most people on this list, but going up against Anderson Silva, he was basically an unknown. Number 5, Steve Erceg. You might have already noticed a theme with this video in that a lot of these unknown fighters got their shots a few years ago, or maybe when divisions were just getting started, which is why in 2024 it makes Steve Erceg's opportunity to win a UFC title stand out. All this happened to Steve in just 10 months of making his UFC debut. Before he got there, he was over in Eternal MMA, which has been one of the longest and most consistent shows out in Australia, but still not really a promotion a lot of fans sit down to watch every Saturday. Steve made good on his UFC debut, and with 3 decent performances and about 40 minutes inside of the UFC cage, he was ready to take on the world champion.
I thought that if I could win the last round at least, I gave myself a chance, and I just blew it.
Number 4, Valerie Letourneau. 2015 was a pretty fun year for MMA. Superstars like Conor and Ronda were on top of the world, but at 115-pound, Joanna Jędrzejczyk began defending the crown she put on her head as queen of the division. Unfortunately though, at first, she didn't have a lot of contenders to choose from. First person to get a shot was Jessica Penne. She was on the semi-finals of the Ultimate Fighter season. She lost to Carla Esparza, but before that she had won an atomweight title in Invicta. This was before women were in the UFC, so people kind of had paid attention. And then I really think the UFC wanted JoJo Calderwood to fight for the belt next, but in her debut she went up against Marina Moroz, who pulled off a massive upset win, and that kind of ruined that plan. And who did Marina fight next? Valerie Letourneau. Letourneau got the win, and so she got a title shot. Valerie was coming over from Canada, where she hadn't been a champion on the regional scene, and she didn't even get any of the rub from the Ultimate Fighter season. She got tapped out by Roxanne Modafferi when trying to get into the show on the first episode. Safe to say Letourneau was just thrown in there as there weren't many other options, and not many people really knew who she was. Number 3, Weili Zhang. Right now it feels like Zhang Weili has never been more popular. She's been working on her English recently, and fans absolutely love it when foreign athletes can say even a few words.
What's up, Boston?
Now Weili has been fighting like a badass since she got into the UFC, but when she entered the title picture, to a lot of fans it pretty much felt like she just appeared out of nowhere. After 17 fights in Asia, Zhang arrived in the UFC. She'd been a world champion in the Kulon Fight MMA League, but that's not a promotion many of you have probably ever heard of until I just said it right there. She debuted in the US for the first time at 227 in California, and then her next fight was right back to China in a fight night where she got a win over Jessica Aguilar. That lined her up against Tecia Torres, where she pulled off another win, but Tecia herself had been a bit of a losing streak. It wasn't like we'd seen Weili go up against the top well-known contenders of the division, but she still got an immediate title shot. Now, I think it did help that the UFC were going to China for a fight night, and it made sense to put a Chinese athlete in for a title shot. But that division had just gone through a trilogy of fun champions with Joanna, Rose Namajunas, and now Jessica Andrade. And it went from that to a just complete unknown challenger for a title fight somewhere in China. And not even on a pay-per-view. Zhang, though, totally showed up and made fans out of everyone when she won the belt in the first round. Number 2, Patrick Cote. In the early 2000s, Canada suddenly emerged as an MMA superpower. You had Carlos Newton winning the welterweight title, but at UFC 50, an event was headlined by a Canadian fighting for another world title. And despite Georges St-Pierre being on that card and actually fighting Matt Hughes, he wasn't in the main event spot. It was, in fact, Patrick Cote who fought Tito Ortiz for the light heavyweight belt. Now, if you don't know who Pat Cote is now, you almost definitely didn't know who he was back then, because he'd only been on the MMA scene for about 2 years. In that time, he had won the TKO Canadian Light Heavyweight Championship at just 5-0, and that already got him an invite to UFC 50, but on the undercard, not against the champion Tito. That spot went to Guy Mezco right up until 4 days out from the fight, where he got injured and pulled out, and so Patrick Cote, I guess the only 205er who was either down to jump in or everyone was okay with, fought Tito on short notice. And yeah, nobody knew who he was when he got the shot. He'd come in from absolutely nowhere, but he did go all the way to a decision with Ortiz, which impressed the hell out of everyone. Number 1, Andre Pederneiras. Now, obviously, these days, it can be pretty hard to get yourself a UFC title shot. You can ask guys like Bilal Muhammad or even Leon Edwards before he won the belt. But the further you go back in history, the easier it seems to be. I mean, if you had a black belt under a Gracie early on, you might as well have been a champion already in some people's eyes. I mean, they were that scary. And Andre Pederneiras got his black belt from Carson Gracie when he was just 22. Now, that was a pretty good credential to have, but did anyone actually know who he was when at just 1-0 he got a shot at the UFC champion? His only MMA fight before that happened in Valetudo, Japan, not even in the UFC, so I think, well, no is kind of the answer. Within the context of this video, I think Andre is the earliest title shot. It's like 1999 or something, so it's fair enough that the division wasn't exactly built up, right? But there had been other credentialed challengers the champ Pat Miletich had already fought. Mikey Burnett and George Patino were both credentialed, fairly well-known guys. Even for the early days of the UFC, Andre Pederneiras' title shot does stand out as an unknown guy just getting thrown in there. Just goes to show how much a Gracie black belt can do for you, eh?
Oh, I gotta get me one of those.
Okay, the video's over. This is a chance for you to get in the comments and say, I knew this fighter. Oh, I'm a hardcore fan. Shout out to all the channel members as well. Every single week, they support the content. There they are. We appreciate all you guys. Go check them out if you want to be a member yourself. Let me know, though, down below. Comment who you thought it was also unknown, or if you disagree with any of these. Cheers for watching the video. You can always give us one of these, a thumbs up, if you want to show some appreciation, or if you're new, click subscribe. I've been Bailey, and thank you very much, guys. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video, all right? Goodbye.